This method for drafting a trouser block was shared with me by a friend who learned it from Central St. Martin's. I've had much better luck with this than the methods in Pattern Making for Fashion Design and the Winifred Aldrich books. The method is nearly identical for male and female with some differences in the measurements that I'll show you. I've tried them both and had success with both, and I'm going to show it to you on a male avatar using the male formula. But first, let's have a look at the formulas themselves. So here are the formulas. I've put these here so that you can screenshot this and have this to use as a reference. You'll see the left side is the female with the female calculations and measurements, everything coded in blue. And the right side is for the male trouser block, everything is color-coded in purple. Everything that is not color-coded and is in black is basically the same. However, you're using the body and garment specs of your respective fit model or avatar. You'll see a lot of this formula works off of these percentage values. So these are a lot of what is color-coded because they are different between the male and female blocks. Some, like this one here, are the same, but for the most part, everything in the color coding are where there are discrepancies between male and female. So if we zoom in here on how to do these calculations, you'll see all of my percentages here. And what those are is a percentage of 1/2 of your hip measurement. So if my total avatar or fit model's hip is 38, I divide that by 2, and that's how I get this math here. So this is just how you calculate a percentage. You multiply by this decimal version of the percentage and your 1/2 hips. So my female hip is 38, half of that is 19, and I'm calculating all of these percentages. And these all correspond to the markings on my pattern that you see with these arrows. The other body measurements you'll need are waist, inseam, and outseam, and I'll talk more about those in the next section. And the knee and ankle I recommend getting from garment measurements, so either standard specs that you have or just finding a reference garment if you don't. You're welcome to use any of the measurements that I use here. I recommend you go to our website, IDES.studio, and down at the bottom go to sizing, and you can check out the size of our avatars. I hope to make our avatars available to download for free soon. Apart from the percentage calculations and taking these measurements, there's a bit of math here to do, and I highly recommend doing this before you get started. So you'll see here that the knee is 3/4 bigger on either side at the back, as well as the ankle is 3/8 bigger on either side at the back ankle. The front waist should be 3/4 bigger, so the waists are effectively identical, and then you take a 3/4 inch dart out of the back. So the math that we do is from the circumference measurement, and then you do a bit of division and some adding and subtracting to get the front versus the back. The differences from female to male are some very minor differences in the percentage calculations, and then you'll see the math is all the same, but you're using the body and garment measurements of a male. So let's start with the waist measurement. So remember that the front waist is 3/4 of an inch bigger than the back. The back waist has a 3/4 inch wide dart that's taken out, and that just helps it curve over the bum where our backs kind of cave in. The difference between the male and female is the female waist sits at the natural waist. If you've seen our avatar video, you'll understand why my waist is marked a little bit below the CLO measurement. So you can either mark it out where you want or use the CLO marking, but your waist for the female should be at the natural waist. The male waist, however, sits at what I call the pant waist, which is kind of just above their hip bone. And it's quite common for this to angle up a lot. It's pretty low in the front and then needs to come up over their bum in the back. So the difference from front to back is kind of extreme. So you will want to draw this in. I used an existing pant as a reference for where to draw this. You can see that the block I have on it here sits a bit above my waist marking, and that's because I ended up using a longer outseam than I should have, and I'm gonna fix this issue actually when we draft our block in a bit. Next after waist is hip. So this is the low hip at the widest point, which is usually the fullest part of the bum. So CLO's measurement on the female is actually quite in line with the marking on the pattern. So for this draft, the hip is marked 2 3/4 of an inch above the front crotch. So my lines are pretty in line with each other. I typically measure my low hip here because I think the CLO marking is too low. But I think in this case for women's, you could definitely use the CLO marking. The CLO marking in men's I find to be much too high for where our marking is on this draft. However, that is the fullest part of the avatar. So you'll still want to use that measurement. And it doesn't matter if it means you have a little bit of extra ease where the hip marking is on your draft. So for circumference measurements, there is the basic circumference tool and surface. The basic will all show up in purple, and the surface will show up with orange dots at the end. I recommend using basic for circumference. What it does is it creates gaps where the body contours in, like you'll see here at the bum. It just wraps around. It doesn't go against the surface of the skin, which is what you want when you do something like a hip, waist, or bust measurement. If you're not familiar with how to use the circumference tools, it's a 3-click process. You left click to start. I always hold shift and go just a little ways over and click again. And then you can rotate around while still holding shift if you want to put a straight circle. Or you can hit your 4 or 6 key to look at the avatar from the side, and you can angle the circle up as needed like I did with the men's pant waist. Then click a 3rd time and it sets the ring. You can do this pretty much anywhere that you would measure circumference, so the arm, the neck, etc. To mark the outseam, you want to start at the waist marking, and I recommend going down to the ankle marking that CLO provides. The same goes for the men's. On this men's one, I used the linear tape measure. So the best way to use this is to make sure as you go, you're left clicking down to set anchor points, especially as you curve around parts of the body. So what this tape measure does, you'll see between the hip and the calf, it leaves a gap and just goes straight down like a real tape measure. So on the women's, I did both. This one is the surface tape measure that hugs the skin, which might give you a slightly longer measurement, but it's probably fine. Just remember, especially for women who are curvier, the linear tape measure, you can see here, mine is cutting through her calf, and that's because I did not put an anchor point at the calf. So just make sure you left click down as you're setting this. I also use the linear tape measure for the inseam, stopping at the same ankle marking as the outseam. The thing to note about the inseam is that you want to start a little bit below the crotch. Remember that your pant doesn't sit all the way up there, and give it a little bit of space here. With the women's, although mine doesn't look like it here, you can start a little bit higher. If you think about it, women's trousers tend to sit a bit tighter at the crotch. So if you want to give a little less space on women's wear, that's fine. For my final women's block, I do stop my pant at the ankle bone. You can see the way it's sitting, it actually looks a bit higher. But you'll see my men's, I did actually add to the length. So the purpose of getting the inseam and outseam, other than needing those measurements, is really to find the difference between the two. Then adjusting length is just adding or taking away the same amount from each one. If we take a look back at our formula, you can see that the recommendation from front waist to front crotch, or basically crotch height, for women is 9.5 to 11 inches. This is basically just the difference between the outseam and the inseam. The women's is bigger because the pant sits higher on the waist. You'll see the men's recommendation is approximately 8 3/4 of an inch. I personally found this to be too short, but my example that you saw just now was 11 inches, and I took that down to be 10 in the end. As mentioned before, the knee and ankle measurements should reference a garment. I don't have a specific amount of ease I recommend. It just depends on how slim of a pant you want. Interestingly, you'll see that my knee placement is high on my women's and a bit low on my men's based on clothes measurements. But this makes perfect sense because my female trouser is a bit cropped and my male one is a bit longer. And the knee placement calculation you'll see is based on the distance between the crotch and the ankle. It is 1/2 the length there and then moved up 2 inches. The last measuring tip I have for you, if you want to double check this crotch height or the difference between inseam and outseam, you can create sort of an L square pattern in your 2D window and use your gizmo to arrange it in 3D to effectively measure that distance from where you marked the crotch up to the waist point. With Edit Pattern, you can drag this ruler pattern up and down until it's in line with your waist. And this segment here is effectively what you're measuring. This is especially helpful in understanding my men's pant pattern. As you can see, my men's ruler measures the recommended spec of 8 3/4. So here I can see why my outseam is so much longer based on how my waist curves up at the side. So in this case, the difference between inseam and outseam may not actually match the recommended specs for front waist to front crotch point. I'm showing this on the men's trouser block, but just remember you can do the exact same thing just using the women's specs. So to start off with, I'm going to use my rectangle tool and make a rectangle that's 20 inches wide by 46 inches tall. This is a pretty arbitrary number. It's just a rectangle that's big enough to draw your block inside. So honestly, you could do the same size for women's. With Edit Pattern, hold Shift and select both sides of the pattern. Right-click on one side and choose Distribute Internal Line Between Segment. Then click OK, and it'll put a line down the middle of the pattern. Now right-click on the bottom segment of the rectangle and select Offset as Internal Line. Enter in whatever length you have for your inseam. The inseam is curved, so it'll end up being a little bit longer than the spec, but that's fine. Now we're going to right-click on that line and offset another line that's 2 3/4 inches up, and this is going to be our hip marking. It's the same distance for male and female blocks. Next, hold Shift and select your crotch line and the bottom hem, and right-click and distribute an internal line between them. This is that halfway point, and this line we're going to select and drag up and tap our right-click and enter in 2 inches. So that's how we get the knee placement. Now we're going to right-click on the bottom segment point of this vertical line and extend and add a point to the pattern outline. That's going to split the bottom hem of our pant into 2 segments. Now we're going to right-click on our hem and split the line for our front ankle. So my front ankle is 7.5 inches. I'm going to split it half that amount at 3.75 inches. Remember, our back ankle is 3/8 of an inch wider on either side. So now you can split the line again at 3/8 of an inch. We'll do the exact same thing on the other side of the ankle. Now we'll split the line to mark out the front and back knee, but the first thing we want to do is choose uniform split into 2 sections so that we put a point in the middle. The back knee is 3/4 of an inch wider on both sides. So find your front knee spec and you're going to split the line at half that amount. Then similar to the ankle, we'll split the line again at 3/4 of an inch. Then do the same thing on the other side. You'll see when you select all 4 segments, this makes up the back knee as well as the back ankle. With Edit Pattern, select this center line, and we're going to mark out this percentage line here at 21%, which marks the point where the hip meets the front rise. So mine is 4.148 inches, so I'm going to right-click on the center line and offset an internal line at that distance. Check reverse direction on if it's on the wrong side of the line. Then enter in your calculation for 21% and say OK. Then we're going to select the bottom point of that line, and holding Shift, just click and drag it up until it's a little bit below the crotch line. It just needs to be lower than where the back rise hits. So then you can right click on this crotch line and you're going to choose Add Point to Intersection. You can marquee over this center point and hit Delete on your keyboard. We just need to add a point where it intersects that vertical line we just drew. We're going to mark out that front crotch point, which is our 11% calculation for male and 10% for female. Mine is 2.173 inches. So I'm going to right click and split the line at that amount. Now we're going to right click on that point and add a perpendicular line to the x-axis. I'm going to hit reverse so that my line goes down instead of up, and then I'll uncheck the extend box and instead enter in a length of 2 inches. This line marks your back crotch point, and whether you're doing men's or women's, it's going to be twice as far over as the front crotch. So select this line to measure it, and then click and drag the line over and tap your right click to enter in that same amount. You'll see the percentage calculation for the male draft is 22% and the front is 11%. For the female, it's 10% and 20%. Marking a vertical line like this allows you to use your inseam measurement to find the placement along this line. Next, we're going to mark out the front hip, which is this measurement here, marked 48%. So my spec is 9.48 inches. So first we need to right click on this hip line here and add point to intersection. Then you can marquee over this middle point and delete that on your keyboard. So now we're going to right click and split the line at your spec for 48% if you're doing men's. If you're doing women's, it's 47%. Now we're going to split the line to mark out the back rise. So for men's, this gap here is 5/8 of an inch, and for women's, it's 3/8 of an inch. Now we'll mark out our back hip percentage. So you'll need to take your back hip spec and subtract this line from it, and the difference will be what you split your line to. For me, that's 11.06 minus 8.855, which is 2.205. So these first two segments will equal your front hip percentage, and the back two segments will equal your back hip percentage. Now it's time to start drawing in some of these lines. So with your internal polygon tool, we're going to connect all of the ankle points to the knee points. Left click to start and double click to end each line. Now we'll draw in our front inseam. So remember, we offset a line at the inseam height. So we don't need to worry about the length here. We're just going to use internal polygon to connect the knee to the front crotch point. Then I'll switch to my Edit Curve Point tool and shape this curve. The front inseam should be fairly straight. Make sure you don't carve it out too much at the top. When I measure my inseam, it's only about 3/16 or 3 mils longer than my inseam spec, so that's pretty negligible. For the back inseam, we want this to be 3/16 of an inch shorter than the front, but only above the knee. So here I've measured my total inseam to get this number, but I actually suggest you just measure from the knee up on the front and subtract 3/16 for how long you should draw your back inseam. Now with internal polygon, we'll draw in the back inseam at the top, but you'll want to shape the line as you go, holding control when you click down to create curve points. You can hit delete on your keyboard if you don't like a point that you made. You're aiming for this vertical marking that we made. You can hover along it until you meet your spec and then double click to finish drawing. A tip for getting the rise, hip, and inseam curves right is we do actually sell pattern making rulers in 3D. I'll put the link in the video description. They're about $350 in US dollars. These are to scale of a real life hip curve and French curve. You'll see I've labeled mine for the different areas on the body because it was tricky to get the angle of the ruler correct. You can rotate them around in different ways. Check out our video on how best to use them. Now, using your outseam spec, you're going to subtract the lower leg from it and then draw in the outseam at the front and back using internal polygon. Make sure you cross through your hip markings. Don't worry too much about how far to curve in at the waist because we'll adjust that later when we draw in our waist marking. If you're struggling to eyeball it, just use the shapes I have here as a reference. Use the horizontal guides to end the outseams at the same height. This will make the back outseam a tiny bit longer because of the hip curve, but we're going to true that up later. Now, using internal polygon, I'm going to draw a horizontal line across my entire pattern, just a little bit below where the outseams end. So you can eyeball this. This is the marking for your front waist height. With Edit Pattern, right-click on the line and add point to intersection. You can remove all of the points except for the front one. Now we're going to split the line at 1/4 of an inch to mark the center front waist. If you're doing women's, you'll want to split it at 3/8 of an inch. Now with internal polygon, we're going to draw in our front rise by connecting these 3 points. Then you can switch to your Edit Curve Point tool and draw in the curve at the hook. You don't want the front hook carved out too much. It's normal that the front rise slopes softly down and the back rise continues to scoop down before sloping back up. Now with internal polygon, we'll draw in our front waist using our spec as a reference. We'll start at that center front point and go straight across until the center line, then put a curve point to curve up towards your outseam. This isn't going to meet your spec exactly at first because remember we need to adjust our outseam placement until our waist spec is accurate. So to do that, first I'm going to marquee over this corner with Edit Pattern and right click to join overlapping points. Now while holding Control and the letter D on your keyboard, you're going to click and drag this point out until the waist matches the spec that you want. Holding the D key is crucial because this keeps any of your curve points from moving. Otherwise, your entire outseam is going to move all together and change your hip spec. So after you do this, you might need to delete a curve point if it's curving in like mine is, but you want to keep the point at your hip. I attempted to achieve my measurement by raising the outseam up a bit, but decided it was better to keep the waist curve more subtle and keep the outseams at the same height. Now we're going to mark the point for where the back rise crosses the waist. This is 1 7/8 for both men's and women's. You'll see above, the back rise extends beyond the waist, and that measurement is different for men's and women's. So I'm going to right click and split this line and enter in 1 7/8. Now we're going to draw in the back rise by connecting the points that we've made. I'm going to hold Control to create curve points as I draw. I might recommend adding a segment point here, so just left clicking without holding Control, because typically it's nice for this line here to be a straight line. Now I'm going to extend this point by 1.5 inches for men's. So with the point selected and holding D and Control, I'll drag it up and tap my right click and enter in 1.5. Then I'm just going to connect this point to my outseam as a straight line. We haven't added our back dart yet, so we want this line to match our back waist spec plus 3/4 inch. So in my case, my back waist is 8 3/4, so this line needs to be 9.5. Like with the front, we first need to marquee and join overlapping points. Then I'm going to click and drag this out, holding both Shift and the D key until my spec meets 9.5. I'm holding Shift to keep it in line with the front outseam. Then with Edit Curve Point, I'll just delete this curve point. Now we're ready to trace out our patterns. So with your trace tool, you're going to hold Shift and select all of the outline of the front pattern. Then you're going to right click on one of the lines and choose Trace as Pattern. Left click to place it down in the 2D background, and then I'm going to click this down arrow to assign it to the fabric that I want. Then repeat the process with the back pattern. Make sure you're zooming in, especially here at the hem, so that you don't miss these little outer segments. Now we're going to clean up our patterns. First with Transform Pattern, I'm just going to delete any unneeded internal lines, leaving only the hip, the crotch, the knee marking, and that center line. Then with Edit Pattern, you can delete any of these little ends that stick off or extraneous segment points that we don't need. If you delete a part of the line that runs into the pattern, you can right click on it and extend it to the pattern outline again. I'll also use the Extend Trim function for my vertical lines to trim them to the edge. I'm going to right click on this segment point at the front waist and convert it to a curve point. Remember, you can only delete segment points if they're part of a straight line, otherwise it will mess up your curve. Now we're going to add our back dart. So right click on the back waist and choose Split and select Uniform Split into 2 sections. Our dart is going to be 3/4 inch wide. So I'm going to right click on the line and split it at 3/8 inch on each side. The dart should be perpendicular to the waistline. So we're going to right click on this center point and add a perpendicular internal line and choose Local. Uncheck the box that says Extend, and here you'll enter in the dart length. Now with Internal Polygon, you can draw in your dart. With Transform Pattern, right click on your dart legs and choose Cut, and you can delete this cutout part of the dart. Now I'm going to clean up my workspace before I put the garment together. I recommend you keep the original pattern draft, but you can move it out of the way in 3D and deactivate it. I'll deactivate everything I'm not using and hide it in the 3D window. I recommend organizing your patterns in 2D over the shadow of the avatar. I'm going to right click on my front and flip it horizontally and then lay it over the front of the avatar. Now we can turn on our arrangement points and arrange our patterns. I recommend clicking on the pattern in the 2D window and then selecting the corresponding blue dot that you want to place it. Then turn your arrangement points off and select both patterns and right click and choose Clone Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. Left click to place them down. If for some reason like mine, they don't end up on the other side of the avatar, just use your gizmo to slide them over. Now we're going to sew our pattern together. I recommend using segment sewing to keep everything distributed in between the balance lines. Remember, the back inseam gets stretched to meet the front, but only above the knee. So you want to keep these sewn together separately and not distribute it all the way down the leg. I'm going to sew the outseam from the knee to the waist, and you can use free sewing to sew the rises and then segment sewing to sew your dart closed. Before simulating, I suggest you select all of the segments that make up the waist with Edit Pattern, and in the property editor, check Elastic On, setting the ratio to 100. This will act as a stay tape to have it retain its measurement and not stretch out and fall down. The other helpful thing you can do before simulating is to turn your measurements on in 3D and use your gizmo to make sure the pattern is sitting at the avatar's waist. So here I'm going to select my back pattern pieces and raise them up a little bit so that they're lining up with the waist. Then you can simulate. I do recommend you turn your internal lines on in the 3D view. These lines act as balance lines for fit. I won't cover all manner of fit issues in this video, but I am going to talk about truing up the pattern. With your Edit Sewing tool, you can select sewing relationships, and by your cursor, it will tell you the discrepancy between the seams. This is why I sew things together in segments, like we did the lower leg. With the lower leg from the ankle to knee, you may see a small discrepancy given the fact that the difference between front and back knee is greater than the difference between the front and back ankle. But this discrepancy should be very small, so I still recommend keeping them sewn together up to this knee point. For the inseam above the knee, remember the back should be about 3/16 shorter than the front. We need to true up our total rise shape. I'll start by moving my front pattern over so that the rises are on the same side. With Edit Pattern, I'll select my inseams and right-click and choose Match Up to start. I can see that my rises come to a little bit of a point at the intersection of the front and back. This is a common error when we draft these shapes. If you turn on the transparent fabric view in 3D, you might even be able to see it kind of peeking up. Mine is sort of flopping over. In order to fix this, I'm going to use my internal polygon tool to draw a cleaner rise shape on top of the patterns. I draw 2 separate segments, one on each pattern, and I try to keep it as close as I can to my original while fixing that shape at the bottom that comes to a point. Once I'm happy with my lines, then I'll right-click on my front and select Rotate parallel to the Y-axis and select that center line. And then I can move it back where it was in 2D. I'm going to right-click on the line I drew and select Extend and add a point to the pattern outline. With Edit Pattern, I'm going to hold Shift and select my new line and the pattern edge outside of it, and right-click on them and choose Replace Pattern Outline. Unfortunately, this error is quite common. The solution is to move the pattern outline away from your line, so I'm grabbing my Edit Curve Point tool to give some space here. Then I'll try again to replace as pattern outline. You'll see on my front, my new line actually sits outside of my pattern outline, so I need to fix this one as well. Just make sure that you remember to extend it and add a point to the pattern outline before you start doing too much editing. After replacing the pattern outlines for our new lines, we need to fix the sewing. With Edit Sewing, I need to drag the inseam sewing back to the crotch point and then extend the front rise sewing down to the crotch point as well. The same issue will exist on the back rise. Now I need to click and drag my marking for the front crotch down to meet the crotch point. Then I'll right-click and trim it to the pattern outline. In order to match my back to my front, with Edit Pattern, I'm going to right-click on the end of this line at the outseam and extend and add a point to the pattern outline. Then I'll measure it and split the outseam of the back at that same amount. Now I could just drag the line at the back down to meet this point, but I'm just going to draw myself a new line. You should use the same method to align the back hip marking to the front. Once everything is aligned from the knee to the hip, we're going to true up the waist. With my Edit Sewing tool, I'm going to drag the back waist sewing down to meet the front by following my blue dot. Then I'll simulate to see how things are looking when the sewing is matching. Basically what I'm looking to see is how I need to adjust the side seam, if I need to take off of the back or add to the front or split the difference. In this case, I've decided to shave off of the back to meet the front. So with Edit Sewing, I'm going to right-click on the back outseam and add point to the pattern on Start. So the start or end is determined by where the ticking mark is in the sewing. Because this segment is a straight line, I can actually just select this segment point and hit delete on my keyboard. it's going to remove the elastic from this segment, so I'm just going to add it back. Now we need to properly shape the pant around the dart. So with my edit pattern tool, I'm going to select both dart legs and right click on them and choose Shape Dart Cap. The blue line is the current pattern outline, and the black line with red curve points will be your new outline. So you can move the curve points to shape the line, and you just want to fill in this area here a tiny bit where the dart is caving it in. Once all your seams are trued up, it can help to turn your measurements on in 3D to see how things are looking and where they're meeting your measurement markings. I've decided just to increase my back rise a bit at the top. If I move this point, it will affect everything below it up to the next segment point. So segment points act as anchors, and the curve points will move with any point that you move unless you hold down the D key. I'm going to extend the hip line and add a point to the pattern outline to create my anchor point. Remember I said that ideally this is a straight line from the hip up. With Edit Curve Point, I'll actually delete any curve points between those two segments. You'll see it will fill in a bit at my back rise. I just want to fill in this little bit that's below my waist marking between the dart and center back. So with Edit Pattern, I'm going to click and drag this point, holding Control to stay along the angle of the back rise, and I'll tap my right click to enter in the measurement that I want to go. I'm going to be conservative and just do 1/8 of an inch. Then with Edit Curve Point, I'm just going to remove some of these curve points, leaving only the one that's right next to my dart. If I wanted to, I could decrease my front rise and blend it to the center back if I wanted to match my waist marking, but I'm pretty happy with how this looks. My waist marking was based off of another pant, so it's kind of up to me how closely I follow it.